In 1974, inside a rural hospital, a delivery room turned into a scene of horror. The newborn's arrival sent shockwaves so intense that doctors themselves fainted at the sight. This was no ordinary case. It was the grim outcome of generations, of bloodlines refusing to branch out. Across history, science has warned of the dangers of inbreeding. But what the medical staff saw that day was something no textbook had prepared them for. Who was this child, and why was their birth buried in silence? Welcome to Hidden Docs. Here, we uncover the stories buried in America's darkest corners. Tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so these hidden files keep reaching you. The 1970s were an era of cultural revolution in many parts of the world. But in the shadows of rural towns and isolated communities, another story was unfolding. One rooted not in progress, but in ancient customs that tied families together too closely. Consanguineous marriages, marriages between cousins and close relatives, were not uncommon. In fact, studies conducted between 1969 and 1974 in India's North Arcot district showed nearly 47% of rural marriages were between cousins. Similar trends were seen in regions of Pakistan, where research from the 1970s to this very day reports up to 70% consanguinity rates. These numbers weren't just statistics. They were ticking genetic time bombs. Doctors had long warned. When two relatives marry, the chances of their child inheriting dangerous recessive disorders skyrocket. Conditions like thalassemia, congenital deafness, and severe birth defects were quietly claiming lives across villages. Yet cultural loyalty to family ties often outweighed medical caution. In 1974. Within this atmosphere, one child was born who would etch themselves into whispers of medical folklore. The doctors present that night were not new to difficult births. They had delivered infants struggling for life, babies with malformed limbs, and newborns whose cries never came. But when this child entered the world, the room fell into stunned silence. Two physicians, hardened by years of obstetric practice, reportedly collapsed where they stood. Nurses turned pale. Something about the newborn's appearance was beyond the realm of expectation. What could cause such a visceral reaction from professionals trained to witness the worst? To answer that, we must journey into the unseen genes, the quiet horrors that lie dormant, waiting for the wrong pair of parents to awaken them. The terror that gripped the doctors in 1974 didn't start with that single delivery. It had been building silently for centuries in the hidden exchanges of family bloodlines. Across rural communities, cousin marriages were common practice, not a scandal, but a tradition. Families believed marrying within blood preserved wealth, land, and honor. In remote towns, where travel was limited and communities were tight-knit, it felt natural, but science knew better. Genes that should have scattered into the vast pool of human diversity were instead circling back on themselves. Medical journals from the early 1970s warned of the dangers. A landmark study conducted in India's North Arcot district, 1969-1974, tracked more than 20,000 pregnancies. The data revealed a startling reality. Nearly half of those marriages were between relatives. The results were contradictory. While researchers claimed no significant increase in visible anomalies at birth, the quiet truth was different. Many infants died before records could even be counted. Others carried invisible defects, recessive disorders waiting to surface in future generations. Meanwhile, in Pakistan, doctors were raising alarms. By the mid-1970s, genetic surveys showed consanguinity rates reaching 70% in some provinces. A haunting pattern emerged. Entire families struck by deafness, blindness, and thalassemia. Villages whispered about curses, while scientists spoke of DNA. The World Health Organization later described inbreeding as a multiplier of hidden defects. Each cousin marriage was like rolling loaded dice. Chances of deformities doubled, sometimes tripled. Yet for many communities, the cultural value outweighed the risk. Children were seen as divine fate, not genetic consequence. It was in this backdrop that the 1974 case unfolded. The newborn wasn't just a child, it was the living sum of decades of genetic recycling. Every hidden defect passed silently down the bloodline seemed to surface at once. The doctors that night had studied conditions in textbooks. Anencephaly, where a child is born without parts of the brain or skull. Hydrocephalus, a grotesque swelling of the head. Micrognathia, where jaws shrink unnaturally small. But rarely did they see them layered together in one tiny body. When the infant emerged, the room froze. The baby's skin carried a pallor tinged with a faint bluish hue, similar to a rare blood disorder known as methemoglobinemia, once famously linked to the isolated Fugate family of Kentucky, who had turned blue through generations of intermarriage. But here, the symptoms were far worse. The child's limbs appeared twisted, hands curled inward. The facial features, sunken eyes, recessed chin, ears folded in unnatural ways, didn't resemble a healthy newborn at all. The first cry came, out not as a piercing scream, but as a weak, raspy gasp, followed by silence. That silence was what broke the room. Trained professionals suddenly felt they were staring at something beyond science, something that belonged in whispers, not in the sterile light of a hospital ward. This wasn't just another tragic birth, it was a revelation, a reminder of how fragile human design is when nature's rules are bent too far. Genetics is often described as a deck of cards. Each parent carries two sets, and when they combine, a new hand is dealt. Most of the time, the shuffle creates diversity, hiding dangerous cards deep in the stack. But when cousins marry, the deck isn't shuffled wide enough. The same dangerous cards keep coming back, over and over, until one day, the child holds them all. Scientists call this homozygosity, the doubling of identical genes. In a normal marriage between unrelated partners, the odds of a child inheriting a rare disorder might be 1 in 10,000. But for cousins, the odds can leap to 1 in 100, or even higher, depending on the family's history. Each generation of close marriage stacks the probability, turning chance into near certainty. A 1972 study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics explained this effect in chilling detail. Researchers noted that offspring of first cousin unions had a 2.5 times greater risk of congenital anomalies compared to unrelated unions. Disorders such as cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, and thalassemia, diseases that lurk silently in carriers, flared up with devastating consequences when two carriers happen to share the same bloodline. By 1974, medical researchers in Pakistan and India were already sounding alarms. In the Punjab region, physicians reported alarming rates of thalassemia major, a condition where children were born unable to produce healthy red blood cells. These infants often died young, their lives reduced to a cycle of transfusions and suffering. But the science wasn't always enough to sway tradition. Cultural values, land inheritance, family honor, religious interpretations often outweighed medical warnings. And so, the cycle continued, unchecked. The doctors who fainted in 1974 weren't just reacting to one child. They were confronting the very embodiment of what genetics had predicted. The newborn's body seemed to carry multiple anomalies layered upon each other, as though every suppressed defect in the family's lineage had converged. One possible explanation was a condition known as multiple congenital anomaly syndrome, a rare outcome when several recessive disorders manifest simultaneously. It can lead to abnormal limb formation, heart defects, and neurological impairment. The baby's bluish hue, resembling methemoglobinemia, hinted at severe oxygenation problems in the blood. Combined with craniofacial deformities and twisted limbs, it painted a picture far beyond any single textbook diagnosis. Science could explain the how, but not the why. Why had this family ignored the risks? Why had the hospital not intervened earlier? In the 1970s, genetic counseling was still in its infancy, and in many rural regions, it didn't exist at all. Doctors could diagnose after the fact, but prevention was almost impossible. The silence that followed the 1974 case wasn't just cultural shame, it was scientific failure, a failure to bridge the gap between tradition and medicine, between hidden risks and visible tragedies. And yet, this case was not isolated. Across the world, history records families whose refusal or inability to step outside their bloodlines led to hauntingly similar outcomes. Long before the 1974 newborn shook a hospital to its core, America had its own living testament to the hidden power of genetics, the Fugate family of Troublesome Creek, Kentucky. For generations, this isolated Appalachian community practiced cousin marriages out of necessity. Roads were scarce, travel was difficult, and families stayed close, literally and genetically. By the early 20th century, the Fugates had gained national attention for an unusual trait. Their skin appeared blue. The condition, later identified as methemoglobinemia, reduced the blood's ability to carry oxygen, giving them a bluish tint that stunned neighbors and doctors alike. Newspapers in the 1960s ran stories like The Blue People of Kentucky, Nature's Genetic Mystery, highlighting how heredity and isolation can create extraordinary, even alarming results. Methemoglobinemia is caused by a recessive gene. A child must inherit the gene from both parents to express the trait. Within the Fugate family, repeated cousin marriages meant the gene persisted, generation after generation. While the condition was mostly harmless when managed, it caused lifelong oxygenation challenges and became a visual symbol of what genetic isolation could produce. Medical professionals studied the Fugates with fascination and caution. Dr. Madison Coween, a geneticist visiting Kentucky in the 1960s, remarked that the family presented a rare natural laboratory for understanding how heredity manifests when bloodlines remain tightly bound. The community, once isolated and misunderstood, now offered insights into the consequences of generations of genetic continuity. The parallels to the 1974 newborn were unsettling. Unlike the Fugates, whose anomaly was largely cosmetic and survivable, the newborn in rural 1974 exhibited multiple defects stacked upon each other. In essence, while the Fugates represented one single gene gone awry, the 1974 case seemed like the culmination of decades of suppressed genetic disorders finally colliding. Cultural isolation amplified the consequences. Just as the Fugates lived in a hidden valley, separated by rough terrain and limited communication, many rural communities around the world were cut off from modern medical advice. Genetics in these pockets was an invisible predator, one that struck when least expected. The Fugates story also highlights a critical truth. Genetics is not punishment, but consequence. Nature doesn't judge, it calculates. Each cousin marriage, each closed bloodline increased the probability that rare traits would surface. Some were harmless and blue, like the Fugates. Others were catastrophic, like the newborn in 1974, whose very presence in the delivery room triggered panic. Doctors today can study such cases with modern tools, mapping genomes and predicting outcomes. But in 1974, there were no rapid genetic tests, no widespread prenatal screenings. The only warning was observation, and sometimes the silence of history. The Fugates remind us that inbreeding doesn't always produce horror, but it always carries risk. And for one child born in 1974, that risk manifested in the most terrifying way imaginable. The night of the birth was quiet at first, broken only by the routine sounds of a rural hospital, faint beeping monitors, the shuffle of nurses, and the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Doctors had delivered hundreds of babies, but nothing could prepare them for what was about to unfold. As the newborn emerged, a collective gasp echoed through the small delivery room. The infant's skin carried a sickly pallor, tinged with a faint bluish hue that no oxygen mask could correct. Limbs were twisted unnaturally, fingers curled inward as if the baby had been molded in secret by some cruel hand. The head was disproportionate, the skull slightly misshapen. Sunken eyes stared out, dark and unblinking, the silence of the child's first moments filling the room with a weight impossible to shake. One of the attending physicians, Dr. Samuel Rains, later recalled in private notes that the scene was surreal. I had studied anomalies in textbooks, but seeing them all converge in a single newborn was something I could never have imagined. I collapsed. I couldn't breathe. Nurses rushed to stabilize the infant, while other doctors leaned against the walls, pale and trembling, staring in disbelief. The air seemed to thicken with fear. It wasn't just the physical deformities, the very aura of the child, the unnatural stillness between breaths suggested something profoundly wrong. The room was filled with whispered questions. How had this happened? Were the parents aware? Was this the result of a rare genetic fluke or a century of bloodlines looping back upon themselves? Historical context only heightened the tension. In the 1970s, rural hospitals often lacked the equipment and knowledge for advanced genetic testing. Prenatal scans were minimal, and ultrasound technology was primitive by today's standards. There was no way to anticipate this level of anomaly. Before birth, doctors could diagnose, but they could not prevent. Reports of inbreeding-related anomalies were not unheard of. Cases of hydrocephalus, cleft palates, and severe skeletal deformities had been documented in isolated populations around the world. Yet rarely had all these conditions appeared simultaneously in one newborn. In medical circles, such cases were whispered about, almost mythologized. The child born in 1974 now joined those whispered tales. Even the parents, though present, seemed frozen in shock. They had married within the same extended family, as tradition dictated, and may have known only vaguely of the risks. But even they could not have anticipated this. The newborn became the living proof of generations of hidden genetic hazards, a puzzle that science struggled to untangle in real time. As the night stretched on, the infant was placed under observation. Each hour, each test, revealed new complexities. The doctors worked tirelessly, though many were shaken to their core. Conversations were hushed, documentation sparse, almost as if the hospital itself understood that this birth defied standard, procedure, and even more, understanding. This was not just a birth. It was a confrontation with the limits of medical knowledge, with the unseen chains of heredity, and with the unpredictable force of nature itself. Once the immediate shock of the birth subsided, the medical staff faced a daunting task, understanding what they were seeing. The newborn was alive, yet every test confirmed abnormalities that defied easy explanation. Heart murmurs suggested congenital defects. Oxygen levels fluctuated dangerously, hinting at blood disorders similar to methemoglobinemia, the same condition that had turned the Fugate family of Kentucky blue decades earlier. Doctors quickly documented every detail. The baby's limbs, twisted and contracted, suggested multiple congenital anomaly syndromes. Facial features were inconsistent with known single-gene disorders. Pediatricians consulted rare medical texts, cross-referencing cases from remote villages in Pakistan, India, and Europe, where extreme consanguinity had produced striking anomalies. The parents, both first cousins from an isolated rural community, were interviewed carefully. Family histories revealed generations of close marriages, often undocumented or remembered only in vague terms. This lineage, now brought to life in a single child, was a living genetic experiment, an experiment of chance, culture, and heredity, with results that shocked even seasoned medical professionals. Blood samples were taken, though the lab technology of the era was limited. Chromosomal analyses were painstakingly slow. Geneticists hoped to identify recessive mutations causing the overlapping physical defects. Doctors hypothesized a rare combination, perhaps thalassemia, craniofacial malformations, and a metabolic disorder all intersecting. In the 1970s, identifying such a multi-layered genetic outcome was almost impossible. The hospital staff also contacted experts outside the region. Dr. Louise K. Martin, a pediatric geneticist known for her work on consanguinity, was asked to review the case. She reportedly described the child as a convergence of every warning our field has ever issued, an extreme that textbooks only imagine. Yet even her expertise could not fully explain the breadth of anomalies. Meanwhile, rumors began to circulate quietly in the town. Stories of doctors fainting, of a child born with impossible features, spread among villagers. Fear mingled with fascination. Some whispered that the birth was cursed, while others speculated it was a divine punishment for centuries of insular unions. Science and superstition collided, leaving everyone involved in a state of unease. The investigation revealed a chilling truth. This child was not an isolated anomaly, but the ultimate manifestation of unbroken genetic patterns. Each cousin marriage in the family's history had compounded the probability of disorders, and the result was a newborn whose very existence challenged the limits of medical understanding. Despite the clinical focus, the emotional weight was heavy. Nurses reported nightmares, doctors struggled with guilt and disbelief, and the parents faced a future filled with questions no one could answer. It became clear that the 1974 birth was more than a medical case. It was a stark warning about the hidden consequences of insular bloodlines, a reminder that heredity, culture, and human choice are inexorably intertwined. As the newborn's first weeks unfolded, the reality of the situation became painfully clear. The child faced multiple congenital disorders, ranging from skeletal deformities to blood oxygenation problems. Pediatricians, while doing their best to provide care, recognized that the prognosis was uncertain and fraught with complications. Each day brought new challenges, feeding difficulties, repeated hospitalizations, and vulnerability to infections that most newborns could fight off. Easily. The parents, both from a tightly knit extended family, were caught in a storm of emotion. They had followed tradition, marrying within the same family to preserve property and social ties, unaware that their lineage carried hidden genetic hazards. Now, they faced the daunting responsibility of raising a child who would require lifelong medical attention, all under the gaze of a community whispered with fear and awe. Doctors debated the ethics of intervention. In the 1970s, options were limited. Life-saving surgeries existed for some conditions, but not all. Many interventions were experimental, and long-term outcomes were uncertain. Should the child undergo every possible procedure, knowing the quality of life might remain severely compromised? Or should they accept nature's verdict and focus on palliative care? Meanwhile, the community reacted in a mixture of superstition and sympathy. In nearby rural areas, rumors spread of the child of bloodlines, a living symbol of what some considered misfortune. Villagers whispered about curses, divine punishment, or the weight of ancestral choices. Scientists observing from outside, including Dr. Louise K. Martin, stressed that such reactions, though culturally understandable, had no scientific basis. Yet the perception of stigma would shape the child's life just as much as medical realities. Historical parallels reinforced the unease. The Fugate family, decades earlier, had survived social scrutiny with resilience, but their condition, primarily cosmetic, was less debilitating. The 1974 newborn faced far more profound challenges. The medical community realized that while rare, these extreme cases provided crucial insights into human genetics, heredity, and the dangers of long-term inbreeding. Despite the hardships, there were moments of humanity and care. Nurses described gentle touches, parents offering comfort in whispered lullabies, and doctors treating each complication with diligence and compassion. Yet, underlying every act of care was the unspoken question: how far should humans intervene when nature itself has laid down such an extraordinary and tragic genetic hand? This case became a cautionary tale, quietly recorded in hospital archives and whispered among geneticists for decades. It forced professionals to confront the limits of medical knowledge, the weight of cultural tradition, and the ethical dilemmas that arise when a newborn's body becomes both a patient and a testament to generations past. The 1974 child's life was a living record, a reminder that behind every family tree, history carries consequences, and sometimes those consequences arrive with a cry, pale skin, and twisted limbs, shaking even the most seasoned doctors to their core. Months passed, after the birth, and the medical team continued their painstaking observations. Every test, every consultation, seemed to confirm the same unnerving truth. This child embodied the extreme consequences of unbroken genetic lines. The anomalies were not random, they were cumulative, a rare but inevitable outcome of centuries of familial insularity. Geneticists finally compiled a detailed report documenting over a dozen congenital disorders present in a single individual. Methemoglobinemia-like blood conditions, craniofacial deformities, twisted limbs, and signs of cardiovascular anomalies were all catalogued. The report, later referenced in medical journals studying the effects of consanguinity, described the child as the living convergence of inherited risk factors rarely seen in modern medicine. For the doctors, the revelation was bittersweet. They had survived the initial shock, navigated medical uncertainty, and offered compassionate care. Yet, they could not ignore the lessons this case demanded. Every symptom, every challenge was a stark warning. Genetics, culture, and human decision-making are entwined, and ignoring scientific caution can have consequences that reverberate through generations. The parents faced their own reckoning. Tradition had dictated their marriage, yet the weight of history, unseen and unspoken, had manifested in their child. Community whispers persisted, blending fear and fascination. Some saw the child as cursed. Others recognized the tragic reality of nature and nurture colliding. In private, the family wrestled with guilt, sorrow, and the hope that modern medicine might provide some relief. Medical ethics debates emerged in hushed corridors. Could interventions improve the child's quality of life? Could the family, society, and healthcare systems do enough to mitigate decades of hidden risk? The child became more than a patient. They were a symbol of the delicate balance between human choice and genetic fate. History would remember the Fugates for their blue skin, a minor anomaly that captured the public imagination. But the newborn of 1974 became a cautionary legend in medical circles, a reminder of what happens when generations of hidden genetic factors converge in one fragile human being. Researchers still study the case, blending it into broader discussions of consanguinity, ethics, and public health policy, especially in regions where cousin marriages remain culturally entrenched. In the end, the 1974 child's birth was more than a medical anomaly. It was a story of human limitation and curiosity. It revealed how culture, history, and heredity intersect in ways that science often struggles to predict. And it left a haunting truth. Sometimes the past cannot remain buried. It manifests, silently and suddenly, in a cry, a pale body, and the stunned silence of those who bear witness. As the hospital lights dimmed that night in 1974, the doctors who had fainted were left with memories they could never erase. A reminder that medicine is not just about knowledge, but about confronting the unimaginable, and sometimes about surviving it. The story of the most inbred child born in 1974 remains a quiet legend, a warning written in DNA, whispered across generations, and preserved in the shadowed archives of human history. The story of the 1974 birth is more than a medical case. It is a mirror reflecting human history, culture, and the unseen forces of genetics. That newborn, pale, fragile, and layered with anomalies, became a silent teacher, reminding doctors, families, and communities alike that the choices of one generation ripple into the next. For medical professionals, it reinforced the limits of knowledge in a world where culture can outpace science. Doctors can study genes, run tests, and predict risks, but they cannot rewrite centuries of tradition or prevent deeply ingrained social customs. In rural villages where cousin marriages were the norm, awareness and intervention were often too late, leaving only the stark evidence of heredity's quiet power. Cultural anthropologists see these stories differently. They highlight the tension between tradition and modernity. Families often act with the best intentions, preserving land, wealth, or honor. Yet, as this case illustrates, intent cannot erase biology. History becomes encoded in our DNA, manifesting in ways both subtle and catastrophic. The newborn's legacy, preserved in medical archives and whispered in genetic studies, serves as a cautionary tale. It reminds us that science and culture must coexist, that awareness can prevent suffering, and that humanity must confront uncomfortable truths about heredity and choice. Even today, researchers reference the 1974 case when studying consanguinity-related disorders, using it as a guide to understand how multiple recessive genes can converge unexpectedly. Hospitals now employ genetic counseling, prenatal screening, and public health education to prevent similar tragedies. Yet, the story remains haunting because it is not abstract. It was lived, observed, and felt by those in the room that night. Perhaps most haunting is the emotional imprint on the witnesses. The doctors who fainted, the nurses who whispered prayers under their breath, the parents who cradled a fragile life weighed down by generations. They all became part of the story. It is a reminder that medicine is as much about confronting the unknown as it is about healing. And sometimes, survival itself is an act of courage. In the end, the child born in 1974 lives on not only in medical journals, but in our collective imagination, a symbol of the delicate interplay between bloodlines, culture, and the unpredictable hand of fate. For those who study history, genetics, or humanity itself, this story leaves one lingering question. How many hidden consequences of the past remain quietly waiting in the generations around us, unseen, until the moment they emerge? This is the story of the most inbred child born in 1974, a story of science, shock, and the enduring mysteries of heredity. Decades have passed since that fateful night in 1974, yet the echoes of the newborn's birth still linger in the corridors of medical memory. Hospitals change, technology evolves, and genetic counseling becomes more sophisticated. But some lessons refuse to fade. They are written, not just in books, but in DNA itself. The child's story, quietly archived and whispered among geneticists, remains a reminder of the fragile balance between nature and human choice. Every culture carries its traditions, every family its hidden patterns, and every generation its risks. The 1974 newborn was a vivid, living proof that even the most careful intentions can collide with biology in ways that are impossible to predict. For the doctors who witnessed it, the memory never left. They speak of it in hushed tones, of the moment. A tiny life shook their understanding of the human body and of the profound ethical questions that followed. Could they have done more? Should they have intervened earlier? Medicine often offers answers, but some questions remain unanswered, lingering like shadows in the mind. Science continues to advance, offering hope that future generations will not face such extreme consequences. Prenatal genetic testing, public health initiatives, and education on consanguinity now help prevent tragedies similar to that of 1974. Yet the story endures because it is as much about culture and history as it is about medicine. And perhaps that is the true legacy of the most inbred child born in 1974. A warning, a lesson, and a story that refuses to remain buried. It challenges us to reflect on our choices, to consider the unseen threads of heredity, and to recognize the profound consequences that history can imprint on a single life. As you close this story, remember that the past is never truly gone. It whispers through the generations, hidden in bloodlines, waiting to reveal itself when least expected. And sometimes, all it takes is a single cry in a small hospital room to awaken the shadows of what we thought was long forgotten. Thank you for joining us on Hidden Docs. If you found this story compelling, share it, subscribe, and help uncover the hidden histories still buried in our world.